The Galactic Council chamber was carved from the bones of a dead moon. That was not a metaphor. The Vorathi people had literally hollowed out a dead moon, polished its white rock into smooth walls, and placed their most important meeting room at its center. They believed it sent a message. We sit at the heart of something dead, and we made it useful. They were very proud of this. On the day that changed everything, 43 species sat in that chamber. They had seats shaped to fit their bodies, coiled platforms for the serpentine shawl, pressurized tanks for the gas-breathing moor, flat cold slabs for the choreth who absorbed heat like sponges. The chamber smelled of 43 different biologies, and it was, by any reasonable measure, impressive. Ambassador Drell of the Vorathi stood at the center podium. He was tall, blue-skinned, with 4 arms, and a face that had never in his life shown anything close to fear. He had governed sectors. He had ended wars with a signature. He had once looked a Choreth warlord in the eye and told him to sit down, and the warlord had sat. He was afraid now. Not visibly, but the people who knew him, the 2 aides standing at the back wall, they saw it in the way his second and third arms were very, very still. The matter before the council, Drell said, is the question of the Sol system. Around the chamber, 42 species shifted in their seats. This was not a new topic. The Sol system, a small, unremarkable star on the outer arm of the galaxy, had been a topic for 11 years now. Since the first scout ships came back with footage. Since the footage had been reviewed, flagged, reviewed again, and quietly put in front of people who did not sleep well after watching it. The species in that system called themselves humans. They were young, embarrassingly young by galactic standards, barely 10,000 years of civilization, which in the galaxy's long memory was roughly equivalent to an infant who had just learned to stand up. Their technology was generations behind the major powers. Their ships were slow and loud and crude. They had only recently discovered faster-than-light travel, and the way they discovered it, by strapping a prototype engine to a vessel held together with something they called duct tape, and firing it with one person inside who had apparently volunteered for the privilege, said something about them that most species found difficult to process. They were, by every measurable standard, not a threat. This was the argument of 41 of the 43 species in the chamber. The 42nd species, the Shal, had no strong opinion and were mostly there because they had been invited. The 43rd species was the one that had asked for this meeting. The Veth. Ambassador Vane of the Veth did not have a body in the way most species understood the word. She was a cluster of organized light and memory that traveled in a glass sphere the size of a large melon. The sphere sat on a special platform at the council table. Inside it, colors moved and shifted like something was thinking very hard. She had lived for 600 years. Her species had been a galactic power for 4,000. They had fought wars that lasted centuries. They had seen empires rise and collapse and rise again. They were, by general consensus, the oldest and most experienced military intelligence in the known galaxy. She had been trying to get this meeting for 3 years. "We have reviewed the Sol system intelligence," Drell said carefully. "Ambassador Vane has requested time to address the council directly on the subject of humanity. The floor is hers." The sphere pulsed. A translation voice came from a speaker beside it, smooth, genderless, perfectly clear. "I will be brief," Vane said. "Do not attack humanity." Silence. Then, from the Moor tank, a low bubbling sound that translated as a laugh. The Choreth representative made a grinding noise with their outer shell, also a laugh. Around the table, in various biological expressions, 42 species found this funny. "Humanity," said High Commander Vreth of the Choreth, "does not have a single warship that could threaten one of our patrol frigates. Their fastest vessel travels at 0.3 light speed. Their weapons cannot breach standard military shielding. They have been to 3 star systems. 3. We have standing fleets in 400. You are asking us to fear a species that still uses chemical rockets for ground-to-orbit transport. I am not asking you to fear them, Vane said. I am asking you to leave them alone. On what basis? The sphere shifted colors, something that looked almost like patience. We have been watching humanity for 60 years, Vane said. Not because they are powerful, because of what they are. We have watched how they respond to pressure. We have watched what happens when they are cornered. We have reviewed their history, all of it, from their earliest written records to the present day. I have spent 60 years trying to find a species in this galaxy that has survived what humanity has survived and come out the other side still standing. I have not found one. Vreth made the grinding noise again. Sentiment. Vane said. Humanity has been visited by 3 extinction-level events in their recorded history. A plague that killed 1/3 of their population in 4 years. An ice age that collapsed their first civilization entirely. A volcanic event that reduced their entire species to an estimated 10,000 individuals. 10,000. We have scout ships with larger crew manifests. By every model we have for species survival probability, humanity should not exist. They do. They rebuilt. Each time, they rebuilt faster than the time before. The chamber was a little quieter now. Their history is not a history of peace, Vane continued. It is a history of war. They have been at war with each other continuously for as long as they have had records. They have fought over land, water, religion, ideology, and once, memorably, over a bucket. They have developed and deployed weapons against their own kind that they themselves classified as too dangerous to use again. Their nuclear arsenal at its peak could have ended their biosphere 14 times over. They kept building. They did not stop. They have not used those weapons, said the Shah representative mildly. No, Vane said, they have not, and that is the most frightening thing about them. They built the capacity for complete self-annihilation and then chose not to use it. That requires a kind of restraint that is not weakness. It is control. A species that knows exactly how much force it could apply and chooses to apply less, that species knows what it is doing. Drell, who had been quiet, spoke carefully. You are suggesting that if we attack them. I am suggesting that you will not win, Vane said. Not in the long term. You may win early battles. They will lose ships. They will lose people. They will be pushed back. And then they will adapt. Every piece of data we have on human conflict shows the same pattern. Early losses, adaptation, and then something that our models do not have a clean word for. The closest translation in your language is they decide. They decide what? Vreth asked. To win, Vane said. Simply that. They decide that losing is not acceptable, and after that decision they become something different, something that does not stop. We have no data on what happens when a species like this is pointed outward at an external enemy with their full industrial capacity behind them. We do not want that data. The cost of collecting it would be too high. The chamber sat with that for a moment. Then Vreth said, they have 40 ships. Today, Vane said, yes. Our 7th fleet alone has 6,000. Today, Vane said again, yes. You are asking this council to shape its military strategy around a hypothetical future in which a primitive species with 40 ships somehow becomes our equal. I am asking this council, Vane said very quietly, to not create that future. There was a long pause. Then the vote was called. It was not close. 41 species voted to proceed with the annexation of the Sol system's outer planets, rich in resources, conveniently located, and occupied by a species that could not stop them. The Veth abstained. The Shal, who had no strong feelings either way, voted with the majority because they had a trade agreement with the Choreth and did not want trouble. Ambassador Vane's sphere dimmed slightly as the votes were read. Drell, passing her platform on his way to the exit, paused. His second arm, the one he used for things he meant, made a small gesture of apology. The sphere pulsed once. It might have been acknowledgement, it might have been something else. Outside the chamber, Her aide, a young Veth who had been with her for only 30 years and still thought most problems could be solved, asked if they should appeal the vote. No, Vane said. Should we try again, request another session? No. Then what do we do? The sphere moved through the corridor slowly. We document, Vane said, very carefully everything that happens next. The aide did not understand why that felt like the most ominous thing he had ever heard. He would later. 6 months after the vote, the Choreth 7th Fleet crossed into the Sol system. They came in at the edge, Neptune first, because Neptune had helium-3 in its atmosphere, and the Choreth needed helium-3, and there was nobody on Neptune to make things difficult. The plan was clean. Extract resources from the outer planets. Establish a perimeter. Let humanity know that the inner system remained theirs for now as a gesture of what the Choreth called civilized restraint. They expected no resistance at Neptune. What they found was a human research station. 12 people, completely civilian. The kind of place that studied storms and magnetic fields and published papers that 7 people in the universe ever read. Standard protocol was to send a declaration of intent, a legal notice essentially, that this space now belonged to the Choreth Dominion. The station would be given 30 cycles to evacuate. This was considered generous. The Choreth fleet commander sent the declaration. The station sent back a response in 17 minutes. It said, "This is a human installation in human space. You need to leave, now." The fleet commander read this message 3 times. Then he checked to make sure the translation was correct. It was. Then he looked at the sensor readout, which confirmed that the station had no weapons, no shields beyond basic micrometeorite plating, and a crew of 12. He sent back, "Evacuation notice stands, 30 cycles." The station sent back in 11 minutes this time, "We're not leaving, and you should know that we've already reported this to Earth, so you really should leave." The fleet commander, who commanded 6,000 ships and had personally overseen the annexation of 14 systems, found himself in the strange position of being told to leave by 12 unarmed scientists. He did not leave. The station did not leave either. On the 29th cycle, a human vessel appeared at the edge of sensor range. One ship, small, military configuration, though the fleet commander's analysts noted that the weapon's signatures were very basic, very old by galactic standards. One ship. Against 6,000. The fleet commander sent a communication to the human vessel explaining, patiently, what the tactical situation was. The human vessel sent back, "We know, we're just here to witness." He didn't understand that. He would. On the 31st cycle, when the research station still had not evacuated, the Choreth fleet began their extraction operations. It was routine. It was clean. The 12 researchers were transported off the station by force, carefully. No casualties, the Choreth were not barbarians, and the station was disassembled for its metal. The single human ship watched the entire thing. Then it turned and went back toward the inner system. The fleet commander noted this in his log and went back to his work. He was not concerned. He was 6,000 ships. He had nothing to be concerned about. That night, or what passed for night in the deep black, one of his junior analysts knocked on the door of his quarters. She was young, a recently graduated intelligence officer, and she had the look of someone who had found something she didn't want to have found. She handed him a data pad. It was a translation of human communication traffic from the previous 8 hours. He read it. It was not government communications, not military orders, not political speeches. It was their information networks, their public conversation, millions of humans talking to each other about what had happened at Neptune. He read what they were saying. He put the data pad down. He sent a message to Choreth High Command that night. It was flagged as non-urgent because he did not want to seem like someone who panicked, but he sent it. It said, "Request updated intelligence assessment on human response capacity." Specifically, how quickly can they build ships? He did not sleep well after that. Not because of what humans had done. Because of what they were saying they were going to do. And the tone in which they were saying it. He had annexed 14 systems. He had heard species beg. He had heard them threaten. He had heard them negotiate and plead and rage. He had never heard anything quite like this. The humans weren't threatening. They weren't begging. They weren't even particularly emotional, or at least not in ways he could parse. They were just talking about what came next, practically, specifically, like people who had already decided the outcome and were now discussing logistics. One post, shared by several million humans in the span of an hour, which his analyst had highlighted, said simply, "They took Neptune, fine, start the clock." He didn't know what the clock was for. He had a feeling he was going to find out. The phrase "start the clock" was not an official military order. It was not issued by any government. It was not a declaration of war, though the declaration of war came 2 days later in very formal language with a lot of very serious people standing at very serious podiums. It was not in any military doctrine, any strategic handbook, any document with a seal on it. It was said by a dock worker named Peter, who worked at the Luna shipyard, who had been watching the news feed on his break when the footage of Neptune came in. He had watched the Choreth ships surround the research station. He had watched 12 scientists get pulled off their home of 4 years and loaded onto a foreign vessel. He had watched the station, which humans had built piece by piece, hauled up from Earth's gravity well at enormous cost, bolted together in vacuum by people in suits, get taken apart like it was nothing. He had put down his coffee. He had typed 4 words. And then gone back to work. 2 weeks later, his supervisor told him that quote had been shared 140 million times. Peter shrugged. He had work to do. This was, in a way, the thing that Ambassador Vane had tried to explain to the council and failed. It was not a thing that translated well into political language. Humans did not centralize their determination. It was not issued from the top. It came from dock workers on lunch breaks, from engineers pulling double shifts, from teenagers arguing in comment sections, from grandmothers who had never cared about space until the day something took part of it. It was a species-wide decision that no single human made. And once it was made, it was very difficult to unmake. The Earth Defense Council met in Geneva. They met in a room that had bad lighting and worse coffee, and a whiteboard that someone had written on in permanent marker by mistake in 2031 and never quite cleaned off. Important things had been decided in this room before. The people in it were used to important things. They were not used to this. General Amara Osai, who had commanded the African Union's Rapid Response Forces for 12 years before being appointed to the Defense Council, stood at the head of the table and looked at the projections and said, "Tell me the honest number." The analyst, young, tired, had clearly been there since the previous night, said, "Current fleet capacity, 41 active warships, 32 support vessels. Projected enemy force in the outer system, approximately 6,000 warships of a size class that outguns our capital ships by a factor of 4. That's the honest number." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at the whiteboard, at the permanent marker stain. It looked a little like a map of nowhere. "Okay," she said. That was all. The room waited. "Okay," she said again. "So we can't fight them yet. What's the build timeline?" The shipyard director, a woman named Chen who had not slept in 40 hours and was running on a substance she called emergency coffee that contained enough caffeine to vibrate a small dog, put up the next projection. Luna shipyard can increase output by 60% if we go to 3-shift continuous operations. Mars shipyard is already at capacity, but we can expand. We have been expanding. The legislature approved funding last week. The asteroid belt facilities are the real opportunity. We have 17 existing stations that can be converted to weapons production. We've been conservative about militarizing the belt because until 2 weeks ago, nobody was shooting at us. And now we are considerably less conservative. She tapped the projection. 18 months, we double the fleet. 36 months, we have something that looks like a real military. 60 months. 5 years, General Osai said. 5 years, we have a fleet that can challenge a regional power. Chen paused. Probably, depending on what they build in the meantime. The room sat with this. And in the meantime, someone asked from the back. In the meantime, Osai said, we don't throw 41 ships at 6,000. In the meantime, we make them pay for every meter they advance. They haven't advanced past the outer system yet. They will, she said it simply, the way you say things that are already true even if they haven't happened. They came here for resources. Neptune was easy. They'll want more. We make more expensive. We harass, delay, attrit. We make them feel every ship they have to dedicate to holding their position. We make Neptune cost them 3 times what it's worth. With 41 ships. With 41 ships. The room went quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not doubt, something closer to calculation. General Osei turned back to Chen. The belt stations. How fast can the first one convert? 90 days if we push. Push. Chen nodded. She was already thinking about her next emergency coffee. The Choreth fleet commander's name was Grath Velson, and he was having a bad month. Not catastrophically bad. The Neptune operation was complete. Extraction was proceeding. The helium-3 numbers were good. High command was pleased. On paper, everything was fine. In practice, he had started sleeping with the fleet-wide alert system on a dedicated screen on his bedside table, which was not a thing he had ever done in 14 years of command. The human harassment campaign had started 8 days after the Neptune incident. It was not dramatic. That was the thing. He had been expecting drama, a speech, a formal declaration, a bold suicidal charge by their tiny fleet. Humans were supposed to be emotional. Everything he had been briefed on said they made decisions based on emotion and had to be managed accordingly. What he got instead was a destroyed relay station. It happened quietly, in the deep dark between Neptune and Uranus. 3 human ships, small, fast, what they apparently called destroyers, hit the relay station from 3 angles simultaneously, pulled out before his response ships could get weapons lock, and were gone before he had finished reading the incident report. The station was not critical infrastructure. It cost him 2 days of reconfiguration time. That was not the point. The point was that they were telling him they could reach his support network. They were telling him they knew where it was and could hit it and leave. They were telling him, in the language of small, careful actions rather than words, that they were not paralyzed by the math of 6,000 versus 41. He sent a report to High Command. High Command told him to increase patrol density and continue extraction. He increased patrol density. 12 days later, a Choreth patrol frigate simply disappeared. No distress signal, no explosion detected, no wreckage. It was there and then it wasn't. The search operation found nothing. This bothered him more than the relay station. The relay station said, "We can hit your infrastructure." The missing frigate said, "We can hit your fleet and you won't know how or when." He sent another report. High Command told him to increase patrol density further and continue extraction. He was beginning to feel that High Command did not fully understand what kind of enemy this was. The answer to his question about how fast humans could build ships came back from intelligence 2 weeks later. He read it 3 times. He called his senior analyst. "This projection," he said, pointing to the line that showed human fleet capacity at 60 months. Is this accurate? The analyst said, within a margin of 15%, yes. At 60 months, they have a fleet of how many? Approximately 800 capital ships and 4,000 support vessels. He looked at that number for a long time. And our current force in this sector? 6,300. And at 60 months, their projected shipbuilding rate exceeds ours, the analyst said quietly, if they maintain this production pace, which they appear to be doing. He thought about the dock worker, the quote, the 140 million shares. Start the clock. He understood the clock now. They weren't counting down to something they feared. They were counting up to something they were building. He sent a third report to High Command. This one he flagged as urgent. He was very specific. He did not use emotional language. He laid out the production data, the harassment pattern, the missing frigate, the relay station, the tone of human public communications. He recommended that the council be briefed on the long-term projection. He recommended that the terms of the Sol system annexation be reconsidered before humanity's fleet capacity made reconsidering it more difficult. High Command responded in 6 hours. The response told him that his concerns had been noted, that he was perhaps too focused on a minor border annexation and losing strategic perspective, that the Sol system was a primitive backwater with a precontact species whose current military capabilities were negligible, that he should continue extraction and not let the harassment campaign of a desperate minor species distort his assessment. He read this response. He saved a copy. He had a feeling he was going to want it later. On Earth, in a converted factory on the outskirts of Sao Paulo, 18 engineers were working on a problem. The problem was this. Choreth ships used a shielding system that human weapons couldn't currently penetrate. The shields operated on a frequency that absorbed energy blasts before they could do structural damage. This was why the 41 human warships had not simply charged the 6,000 Choreth ships. This was why the strategy was harassment and delay rather than open battle. This was the wall. The 18 engineers had been awake for 60 hours. The room smelled of cold food and whiteboard markers, and something one of them called the specific scent of a problem that's almost solved. At 3 in the morning, a woman named Dr. Fatima Haydari walked to the whiteboard and drew a curve. "We're thinking about this wrong," she said. The room looked at her. "We keep trying to punch through the shield on its own frequency. That's what it's designed to resist. We're fighting it on its terms." She tapped the curve. "What if we don't punch through? What if we make the shield fight itself?" "The shield fights itself how?" She started writing equations. Her handwriting was terrible and fast and certain. "The shield absorbs energy. That's its mechanism. It takes in what we throw at it and distributes the load across the field matrix. But there's a limit to how much it can absorb before the distribution system lags." She wrote a number. "This is the saturation point. Above this threshold, the distribution system can't process fast enough, and the field starts to stack energy rather than distribute it. And a stacked field amplifies rather than absorbs the next hit," she said. "You saturate it, and then you hit it again immediately, and it doubles the energy back through its own matrix." The room was quiet. "You need very precise timing," someone said. "Yes. And very fast reload rates." "Yes, which our current weapon systems don't have." She put the marker down. "But if we redesign the firing cycle..." Someone else was already at a second whiteboard. They did not sleep that night. When the morning shift came in, the design was on the wall, rough, full of problems, but there. Haydari sent the concept to the Defense Council at 7 a.m. with a note that said, "This needs 6 months to develop into functional weapons. We need authorization to cannibalize parts from the current destroyer class." The authorization came back in 3 hours. She had expected 2 weeks of bureaucracy. She did not know that General Osa had given standing orders to fast-track anything that came from the 18 engineers in Sao Paulo. She found out later. She sent Osai a message that said simply, "Thank you." Osai sent back, "Don't thank me, just build the thing." She built the thing. 5 months into the Choreth extraction operation, Grath Velsan had lost 1 frigate, 2 supply convoys, 4 relay stations, and the feeling of certainty he had arrived with. He had not lost Neptune. The extraction continued. The numbers were good. High Command was still pleased. But the harassment had not stopped. It had gotten more sophisticated. The human ships hit faster and withdrew faster. They seemed to know his patrol routes, which meant they had intelligence assets somewhere in or near his fleet. They prioritized his supply lines with an efficiency that suggested someone had done serious analysis on which disruptions would cost the most for the least effort. They were learning. Every engagement taught them something, and they applied it in the next one, and they did not repeat mistakes. He had never fought an enemy that adapted this quickly. And then the missing frigate stopped being missing. The sixth one they found. Or rather, they found what was left of it. The wreckage pattern told his analysts something that made them file a report that made him sit very still for a long time. The ship had not been destroyed by conventional weapons. It had been destroyed by its own shields. His analyst stood in front of him and explained it very carefully, because analysts are trained to present bad news in a measured tone regardless of how unmeasured the news is. "The shield was saturated at a rate we have not seen before," she said. "The timing of the second strike was precise to within microseconds. The shield attempted to absorb the second impact, encountered the stacked field from the first, and the resulting energy release was amplified back through the matrix," he said. She looked at him. "I know what a stacked field is," he said. "I did not know humanity had developed a weapon to create one. As of 6 months ago, they hadn't. The wreckage analysis indicates this is a new modification, recent." He thought about the 18 engineers he didn't know about. In the Sao Paulo factory, he hadn't been watching. He thought about the intelligence report that said humanity's industrial capacity was doubling, and the production pace was accelerating, and the shipbuilding numbers were climbing and climbing. He thought about the clock. He sent a 4th report to High Command. It was longer than the others. It included the wreckage analysis. It included the shield saturation data. It included the updated production projections. He flagged it urgent, immediate review required. He got back a response that told him to increase patrol density. He put the response down on his desk and looked at it for a long time. He thought about Ambassador Vane in her glass sphere, dimming slightly as the votes were read. He thought about what she had said. "I am asking this council to not create that future." He was beginning to understand what she had meant. He was also beginning to understand that it was too late to not create it. The future was already here. It had just started building ships, 2 years after Neptune. The Choreth Dominion held the outer planets. They had moved inward carefully, incrementally, the way you move a hand towards something that has bitten you before, and now occupied a loose perimeter around the asteroid belt. They had not crossed it, not because of orders, not because High Command told them to wait. Because of what happened the last time they tried. 8 months ago, a Choreth task force of 90 ships had attempted to push through the belt to establish a resource position on one of the larger asteroids. The human fleet at that time numbered 206 warships. By the math, the Choreth should have gone through them like they weren't there. The Choreth task force had gone through the asteroid belt like a hand through a hornet nest. The human ships did not fight like any fleet Grath Velsan had ever encountered in 14 years of command. They did not form battle lines. They did not hold positions. They moved through the asteroids like they had grown up in them, which, in a sense, the crews had, because humanity had been mining and living in the belt for 30 years before anyone pointed a weapon at them. The belt was home. The belt was known. The Choreth ships were enormous and powerful and completely blind to the small, fast shapes that used the asteroids for cover, hitting shields from angles. The fleet's targeting systems had not been programmed to anticipate. The task force withdrew. 40 ships lost. Not 40 ships damaged, lost. 40 ships that went into the belt and didn't come out. The task force commander filed his report. High Command reviewed it. High Command did not order another push through the belt. High Command did not discuss this decision openly. Grath Vel San, who had been watching from the outer perimeter, noted that there was a word for what happened when a military stops doing something because of an enemy action, without explicitly acknowledging that the enemy caused the change. The word was deterred. 2 years after Neptune, the Choreth Dominion was deterred by a species it had voted to casually annex. He wrote this in his personal log, and then sat and thought about whether to delete it. He kept it. On Earth, nobody was celebrating. This was also a thing about humans that was difficult to explain to outside observers. They had stopped the advance. They had destroyed 40 Choreth ships in the belt action. Their production lines were running at 3 times the pace from 2 years ago. They had invented a new weapon system in 6 months that took apart enemy shields from the inside. By any reasonable measure, they were winning, or at least not losing, which at the start of this had looked impossible. They were not celebrating. Not because they weren't proud, they were, not because they didn't understand the significance. They did. It was because the 12 researchers taken from Neptune Station were still in Choreth custody. It was because the outer planets were still occupied. It was because 307 human military personnel had died in 2 years of fighting. It was because 307 was a number attached to names attached to people, and the people who knew those names did not feel like celebrating. This was the thing Ambassador Vane had meant and failed to communicate to the Council. Species that fight for territory or resources can be satisfied. Give them enough of what they want or take enough of what they have, and they will negotiate. The math will eventually change. Species that fight because something was taken, not something abstract, but something specific, 12 people with names and 4 years of work and a station they built, are different. You cannot satisfy them with territory. You cannot negotiate them out of what they've already decided. The 12 researchers had names. Humanity knew the names. Every single one was public knowledge, repeated in news feeds and memorial posts and conversations in break rooms and kitchens, and the spaces between sleep and waking where people lie in the dark and think about things they can't let go of. The Choreth had not killed them. They were in a detention facility, technically unharmed, in a situation that the Choreth considered a fairly standard administrative outcome of annexation. Humanity did not consider it that. Humanity had a word for it. The word was hostage, and the word meant something very specific in the human emotional vocabulary that had no clean translation in Choreth language. General Osai's war plan had 2 phases. Phase 1 was what was happening now. Build the fleet, hold the line, make every inch of outer system space expensive. Phase 2 had a trigger. The trigger was the fleet reaching a size where the math changed completely. Not parity. Osai was not interested in parity. She was interested in a number that meant the outcome of an engagement was not in question. She had a number in her head. She had not written it down anywhere. She had told it to exactly 2 people. One of them was President Miriam Ademi, who had sat across the table from Osai in the Geneva room with the permanent marker stain on the whiteboard, and heard the number and nodded once and said, "Then we wait until we have it." The other person was a man named Admiral Kenji Watanabe, who was going to be the one to give the order when the number was reached, and who spent the time between now and then doing what admirals do when they are preparing to fight a war they intend to win without question. He planned. He planned obsessively. His staff said that the admiral had a plan for every contingency and a contingency for every plan and a backup for every backup. They said this with the fondness of people who trusted their commanding officer completely, which was its own kind of plan. Watanabe himself, when asked about his planning by a journalist who somehow got access to him for 20 minutes, said only, "We lost 307 people. When this is over, I want the number that justifies it to be as large as possible." The journalist asked what he meant. He said, "I want to win big enough that those 307 names mean something permanent." The journalist didn't fully understand this. Most of the galaxy wouldn't have. Humans understood it immediately. The Galactic Council met again 18 months after the Neptune incident. This meeting was not about humanity. It was about a trade dispute between the Shal and a species called the Marath over transit rights through a particular shipping lane. This was the kind of thing the Galactic Council mostly dealt with: trade disputes, boundary surveys, the administrative business of a galaxy that mostly, when left alone, did not blow itself up. But at the end of the meeting, Ambassador Vane asked for the floor. She got it out of habit. The Veth were old and important, and when they asked for time, you gave it to them. "I want to update the council," Vane said, "on the Sol system situation." Drell, who was chairing, made a gesture with his second arm. "Proceed." "The Chorath Dominion has been unable to advance past the asteroid belt for 8 months, Vane said. "In the last 6 months, human fleet production has reached a rate that exceeds any species in this region except the Dominion itself. Their new weapons system, which they developed in 6 months from concept to deployment, has been replicated and iterated upon in 3 subsequent generations of modification, each more effective than the last. Their forces in the belt have established complete defensive dominance of that region." The chamber was quiet. "I want to show you a projection," she said. The display at the center of the chamber activated. It showed a timeline. On the left side was the current date. On the right side was a point 3 years out. In between, a line climbed. "This is the projected human fleet size over the next 3 years, assuming they maintain current build rates, which they are showing every indication of doing." She let them read the number at the end. "At this point, their fleet size exceeds the Chorath 7th Fleet in both numbers and, because of the shield penetration technology, in effective combat power." "That's a projection," Vreth said. He was still on the council. He looked less comfortable than he had at the first meeting. "Yes," Vane said. "Everything in the future is a projection. I projected this 2 years ago and presented it to this council and was voted down 41 to 1. The projection has been accurate." "What do you want?" "I want the council to approach the Chorath Dominion about a negotiated withdrawal from the Sol system," Vane said, "before the humans reach the number at the end of that line. And if the Dominion refuses." The sphere was quiet for a moment. "Then I want the council to understand what comes after that line," Vane said, "because I have seen humans when they are at the number at the end of that line. I have seen the simulations. I have read the history. I have watched them for 60 years. I know what they do when they decide the conditions are right." "What do they do?" "They stop waiting," Vane said. The chamber heard this differently than it would have 2 years ago. The Chorath High Command finally, belatedly, commissioned a full strategic review of the Sol system situation. This was 17 months later than it should have been, which was something the review itself noted in the kind of careful bureaucratic language that means we made a serious error, but we are not going to say it that directly. The review took 4 months. It was comprehensive. It included the production data, the belt engagement analysis, the shield penetration weapons assessment, the harassment campaign evaluation, and projections from 11 different strategic modeling teams. The review was presented to the High Commander of the Chorath Dominion, a being named Vrail who had held that position for 20 years and was used to problems being solved in a briefing room on the Dominion's capital station. He read the executive summary. He read the projections. He asked his chief of staff, how long until they reach the number? 14 months, possibly 12 if they accelerate production in the next quarter. And our assessment of the engagement outcome at that point. The chief of staff had the expression of someone delivering news that is technically accurate but deeply unwanted. At the number, their combined fleet with their current weapons technology against the 7th Fleet at current strength. Honest assessment. We lose. Vrail sat with this. We lose the engagement, or we lose the engagement, we lose the fleet, and without the 7th Fleet we cannot hold the outer system perimeter. The outer system falls. After that, the math continues to move against us because we cannot replace ships at the rate they are building them. Vrail said nothing for a long time. What about reinforcing from other sectors? We've modeled it. Pulling forces from other sectors weakens our position across 8 other systems and potentially invites opportunistic action from the Moor Collective, who have been watching this situation with interest. And even reinforced, the long-term production differential means we eventually lose anyway. Yes. Vrail thought about the vote, the chamber 41-1. He thought about Ambassador Vane's sphere going dim. Options, he said. His chief of staff laid them out. There were 3. 1. Reinforce aggressively now, before humanity reached the number, and attempt to end the conflict quickly with overwhelming force. Risk. Forcing a rapid escalation against an enemy that had shown it adapts under pressure. 2. Open negotiations for withdrawal. Return the outer planets. Return the 12 researchers, accept terms. 3. Continue current posture and hope the projections were wrong. Vrail looked at each option for a long time. What's the probability that the projections are wrong? He asked. They have been accurate to within 8% for 2 years. He thought about Grath Vel San's 4 reports, flagged urgent, answered with instructions to increase patrol density. He thought about the task force that went into the belt and lost 40 ships. He thought about the human dock worker and the 140 million shares. He thought about the word deterred. Send a communication to the Veth ambassador, he said. His chief of staff straightened slightly. On what subject? Tell her I'd like to discuss a negotiated settlement to the Sol system situation. He paused. Tell her it's confidential. I don't want the council involved until terms are agreed. And if the humans won't negotiate? Vrail had a feeling about this. It was not a good feeling. They'll negotiate, he said, but they won't accept the same terms they would have 2 years ago. What terms will they accept? He thought about 307 names. He thought about 12 researchers in a detention facility. He thought about the tone of human communication that Grath Vel San had reported back in the first month, practical, specific, like people who had already decided the outcome and were discussing logistics. I don't know, he said, but I think we should find out before they decide to tell us instead of ask us. The communication went out to Ambassador Vane that evening. She received it in her quarters on the council station, where she had been drafting her weekly report, which had been, for the past 2 years, mostly a record of things unfolding exactly as she had said they would. She read the communication. The sphere pulsed with something that might have been satisfaction, or might have been grief, or might have been both at once, because she was old enough to know that being right about terrible things is not the same as winning. She sent the communication to a human diplomatic contact she had been cultivating for 18 months. The contact's name was Ambassador Yasmin Akafer, and she was very good at her job, and she had been waiting for exactly this moment. She read the message. She forwarded it to Geneva. She typed one line of context. They blinked. And then she began drafting a response that was going to be very polite on the surface and absolutely immovable underneath. Because that was what this moment required, and she was very good at knowing what moments required. The humans had not yet reached the number. They were going to negotiate anyway. But they were going to negotiate like people who knew exactly what the number was and exactly how many months away it was. Which meant they were not going to give anything they didn't have to. The Choreth were about to learn something that Ambassador Vane could have told them 2 years ago. Negotiating with humans after they've decided to fight is very different from negotiating with them before. The price goes up. Every day it goes up. And the humans know it goes up. And they are very patient about waiting for the right price. The negotiations lasted 3 months. They took place on a neutral station owned by the Veth, a small, ancient platform that floated in the space between 2 star systems and was used, historically, for exactly this kind of thing. The Veth had built it 500 years ago with the specific understanding that eventually, in any conflict, someone would need a room where both sides could sit down without either side having home advantage. Ambassador Yasmin Akafar arrived with a team of 9 people and 4 cases of personal effects, which seemed, to the Choreth delegation, like a modest preparation for a major negotiation. The Choreth delegation had 47 members, 3 legal teams, 2 strategic advisors, a specialist in economic treaty architecture, and enough equipment to establish a small office. Akafar looked at all of this and said nothing. She set up her team in 3 rooms. She had a good sleep. She ate breakfast. Then she walked into the main negotiating chamber and put one piece of paper on the table. The Choreth lead negotiator, a very experienced diplomat named Shrenvel Moore, who had conducted 11 major treaties, looked at the piece of paper. "This is your opening position," he said. "Yes," Akafar said. The paper had 4 items on it. Item 1. Complete Choreth withdrawal from all Sol system bodies, including Neptune, within 60 days. Item 2. Return of all 12 Neptune Station researchers, unharmed, within 30 days. Item 3. Reparations payment to the human government in an amount specified in an attached document. Item 4. Formal Choreth acknowledgement in a public document filed with the Galactic Council that the annexation of the Sol system outer planets was conducted in violation of galactic territorial norms. Shrenvel Moore read the 4 items. He read them again. "The 4th item," he said, very carefully, "a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing filed with the Council." "Yes," Akafar said. "That is not something the Dominion can." "I understand that it's difficult," Akafar said. "We're not starting with it because it's easy. We're starting with it because it's what we need." Ambassador, in the history of the Galactic Council, no major power has ever filed a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing in a military action against a species of. He stopped himself. "A species of what?" Akafar asked pleasantly. Shrenvel Moore had been a diplomat for 30 years. He recovered. "A species at our level of conflict. We're not asking you to file it because it's common. We're asking you to file it because it's accurate." He spent the first week trying to remove item 4. He did not remove item 4. By the end of the first week, both sides understood something about how this negotiation was going to go. Akafar was unfailingly polite, genuinely engaged with the procedural details, completely fair about logistics and timelines and the technical structure of the treaty. She gave ground on scheduling. She gave ground on the specific language of the reparations calculation. She gave ground on the order of operations for the withdrawal. She did not give ground on what the treaty meant. Item 4 stayed. The reparations number came down by 8% through legitimate accounting disagreements and came back up by 6% when her team produced 3 documents Shrenvel Moore had not known existed. The 60-day withdrawal timeline was negotiated to 62 days with a specific exception for equipment already in transit. The 12 researchers were the one item where HFY did not negotiate at all. On the second day, Shrenvel Moore had suggested, as a procedural matter, that the return of the Neptune station personnel might be linked to progress on the reparations calculation, a standard piece of diplomatic leverage, not a threat, just an acknowledgement that complex negotiations involve complex linkages. HFY had listened to this very carefully. She had nodded. She had been quiet for a moment. Then she said, "If the 12 researchers are not returned within 30 days of signing, regardless of the status of anything else in this treaty, we reserve the right to void all terms and resume military operations at a time and scale of our choosing." Shrenvel Moore had heard negotiators say things like that before. The key question was always, do they mean it? He looked at HFY. He looked at the 9 people behind her. They were all very calm. They were the calmness of people who have done their math and like their numbers. He withdrew the linkage suggestion and did not raise it again. The 12 researchers were not negotiating leverage. They were the reason. He had known this intellectually. He understood it more directly now. On the 47th day of negotiations, Shrenvel Moore did something unusual. He asked HFY if he could speak to her privately, not as negotiators, just as 2 people in a room. She considered this for a moment, then she said yes. They sat in a small side room, no aides, no recording equipment. Shrenvel Moore was old enough to be what his species considered wise, which meant he had made enough mistakes to know how they worked. "I want to understand something," he said. HFY waited. The 4th item, the public acknowledgement. Politically, it costs us enormously. It weakens our position with the Moore Collective. It gives every species with a grievance against the Dominion a piece of paper to wave. I understand why you want it. What I want to understand is, why is it worth more to you than a larger reparations number? Because I can offer you more, substantially more. I have authorization to increase the reparations figure by 40% if we remove item 4. HFY looked at him for a moment. "Because it won't happen again," she said. "The acknowledgement. The Neptune situation. It won't happen again if the acknowledgement is on record. Another species will think twice before doing what you did because there will be a document that says doing what you did is wrong. The reparations money matters. The acknowledgement matters more." She paused. "It matters for 100 years from now, when we're both long gone and whatever we built here is still standing." Shrenvel Moore thought about this. "You're building precedent," he said. "We're very young," HFY said. "We're 10,000 years old in a galaxy that's 4 billion years old. We know we're young. We know we're going to make mistakes and other species are going to try to take advantage of us and we're not always going to be ready." She was quiet for a moment. "What we can do is make sure the framework around us is as fair as possible, so that when we're not ready, there's still a rule that says what happened to us was wrong. That's worth more than 40%. Shrenvel Moore was quiet for a long time. "You're going to be very difficult to deal with," he said, "as a species." "I know," she said. "I'm sorry about that." She did not sound entirely sorry. The treaty was signed on day 91. All 4 items remained. The signing ceremony was brief. The Choreth delegation signed without ceremony. HFY signed with a pen she had brought from Earth, an old-fashioned physical pen, the kind that used ink, the kind that humans had been using to sign important things for centuries. Shrenvel Moore noticed the pen. "Symbolic?" he asked. "Everything important should be signed with a real pen," HFY said. "I don't make the rules." She absolutely made that rule. It was hers. The 12 researchers were transported back to human space on day 28 of the post-signing period, 2 days ahead of the deadline. The first one off the transport, A geologist named Dr. James Obi, who had been on the Neptune station for 4 years, stepped onto the arrival platform in Geneva and looked around at the cameras and the people and the completely overwhelming fact of being home. And then he sat down on the floor because his legs decided they were done. A woman from the diplomatic corps crouched next to him. She offered him a bottle of water. He took it. He said, "Is the station gone?" She said yes. He nodded. He drank the water. He didn't say anything else for a while. The footage of him sitting on the floor was shared 2 billion times. It was not dramatic footage. He was just a man sitting on a floor drinking water. He didn't make a speech. He didn't cry, or at least not where the cameras could see. He just sat there, existing, which is what people do when they have been very far away from themselves and then come back. The comments under the footage were the kind that humans write when they feel something that doesn't fit in words, so they try anyway. Pieter, the dock worker, who had not known his 4 words, would still be circling the internet 3 years later, watched the footage on his break. He put down his coffee. He didn't type anything. He went back to work. The clock was over. Except it wasn't, because the Choreth had signed a treaty, and the Choreth had withdrawn from the outer planets, and the 12 researchers were home, and humanity had won. On paper, this was the end. But the shipyards were still running. Not at the wartime pace. Not anymore. The 3-shift continuous operations had scaled back to 2, but they were running. The asteroid belt facilities had not been decommissioned. The engineers in Sao Paulo had not been reassigned. Admiral Watanabe had not retired, though he had taken 2 weeks off to visit his parents, which his staff agreed was long overdue. General Oss had put it in the simplest possible terms in a memo that was technically classified, but had a way of being discussed in the kind of conversations that happen in hallways and kitchens. The memo said, "We won this because we were ready. We were ready because we built the capacity. We do not dismantle the capacity because one species signed a treaty." The galaxy was very large. There were other species out there who had seen what happened to the Choreth and were drawing conclusions. Some of those conclusions were, do not attack humanity. Some of them were, if we're going to attack humanity, we need to be faster than the Choreth and hit before they can build up. Oss knew both conclusions were being drawn. This was not pessimism. This was what you knew when you had spent 12 years understanding how species behaved under pressure. You build enough that the first conclusion is more popular than the second. You keep building until the second one stops being considered at all. The Galactic Council received the signed treaty and filed it. The acknowledgement of wrongdoing, Item 4, was entered into the official record and became publicly accessible to any species with Council access, which was most of them. There were reactions. The Moor Collective expressed displeasure because they had trade agreements with the Choreth and a public weakness in the Dominion's record was inconvenient for them. They said so loudly. 4 smaller species, the Tenhari, the Greel, the Voss Confederation, and a species with a name that didn't translate cleanly but roughly meant, the ones who live in rings, contacted human diplomatic channels within 3 weeks of the treaty filing. Not to discuss conflict, not to establish military arrangements, to establish diplomatic relations. These were species who had grievances with the Choreth Dominion that predated humanity's existence as a spacefaring civilization by decades. These were species who had watched the treaty with the same attention that Ambassador Vane had watched the vote, and who had drawn their own conclusions. The conclusion was, here is a species that fights until the terms are right and does not accept bad terms because bad terms are easier. Here is a species worth knowing. Okafor handled all 4 contact requests personally. She stayed up late for 3 days to get the timing right. She wrote each response herself, which her staff said was unnecessary and she said was necessary, And she was right, because the specific weight of those letters, the care in them, was noticed by the species who received them. Alliances are not just agreements. They are the feeling that the other side takes you seriously. Humanity had learned this slowly, from 10,000 years of taking each other seriously and occasionally terribly, but always personally. They were good at this. Ambassador Vane watched the treaty filing from her quarters. She had been on the council station for 3 years. She was tired in the way that old things get tired, not physically, but in the deeper place where certainty lies. She had been right. She had been right about what humanity would do and how long it would take them and what it would cost. She had been right about the Choreth miscalculating. She had been right about everything. She did not feel good about this. She felt the specific weight of being the one in the room who sees the car about to hit before anyone else does, and shouts, and is not heard, and watches the car hit, and then helps with the aftermath. She drafted a message to Okafor. She had met Okafor once briefly at a council function. Okafor had been the kind of attentive that suggested she was cataloging everything in the room and would remember it later. The message said, "Well done, I hope the precedent holds." Okafor replied within the hour. The reply said, "Thank you for the warning you gave 2 years ago. We know you gave it. It mattered even when it wasn't heard." Vane read this several times. The sphere shifted colors slowly, like something thinking about something it wasn't sure how to feel. It mattered even when it wasn't heard. She saved the message in a file she had been keeping for 600 years. A file that contained all the things people said to her that were worth keeping because they were true in a way that most things aren't. It was a long file. This went near the top. The Choreth Dominion did not collapse all at once. That was not how things like this happened. Empires did not fall the way trees fall, one clean moment, one loud sound, and then down. They fell the way glaciers moved, slowly. Then, at some point that was difficult to identify exactly, faster. Then all at once, and you looked back and realized the faster part had been going on much longer than anyone admitted. The Dominion's problems had started before Neptune. They had been there in the way that certain things are there before anyone looks, the stress fractures in a material that looks solid until the moment it doesn't. The Dominion was built on a simple principle: control resources, control power. They held mining rights in 63 systems. They maintained tributary relationships with 11 smaller species. They had agreements with the Moor Collective that made both sides stronger than either would be alone. It was a functional system. It had worked for 400 years. The problem with functional systems is they require all the parts to function. The Sol system campaign had cost the Dominion more than ships. That was recoverable. What was not recoverable was the document filed with the Galactic Council, the acknowledgement. 12 species read that document with specific interest, not because they cared about humanity. They had barely registered humanity's existence until now. They cared about the document because it established something. It said, the Dominion made a mistake and was compelled to acknowledge it. It said, the Dominion, when faced with an opponent willing and able to press the matter, will eventually yield. This was new information. And new information changes the math of relationships. The Tenhari had paid tribute to the Dominion for 60 years. The specific tribute arrangement had always been presented as a trade agreement, with the very careful language of mutually beneficial arrangements and shared strategic interests. But everyone who signed it knew what it was. The Tenhari paid. The Dominion did not raid Tenhari shipping lanes. This was a very old arrangement. 60 years of paying. After the treaty filing, the Tenhari Council met in emergency session. The session lasted 6 hours. After it, the Tenhari sent a message to the Choreth Dominion. It said that the existing trade arrangement had been reviewed by the Tenhari Council and was found to be inconsistent with the new standards of territorial norms as established in the official Galactic Council record. The Tenhari were therefore providing formal notice of termination of the arrangement, effective in 90 days, and wished the Dominion well in all future endeavors. It was, possibly, the most polite declaration of independence in the history of the galaxy. The Dominion sent back a message that was not polite. The Tenhari sent back a message that said, essentially, and we have also established diplomatic relations with humanity, and we thought you should know that. The Dominion considered its options. It considered them for 6 weeks. It did not act. Because the math had changed. Because 6 months earlier, when the Dominion held 6,000 ships in the Sol system with nothing credibly opposing them, action would have been simple. But now the Chorath 7th Fleet had returned from the Sol system diminished, and the acknowledgement document was on record, and 844 human warships were operational and present in a galaxy where they had not been present before, and the Tenhari had those diplomatic channels, and the Greel had them too, and the Moor Collective was watching everything very carefully and calculating whether the Dominion was still the strongest horse to be tied to. The Dominion did not act on the Tenhari declaration. This was, possibly, the second most consequential decision the Dominion ever made. The most consequential was the vote in the Dead Moon Chamber, but this one was close. Because the thing about not acting is that it tells the galaxy something. It tells the galaxy that the math has changed. And when the galaxy knows the math has changed, everybody's math changes. The Greel terminated their arrangement 6 weeks after the Tenhari. The Voss Confederation terminated theirs 3 months after that. The species who had no clean translation in any language, the ones who lived in rings, did not have a tribute arrangement to terminate, but they issued a formal statement through the Galactic Council that contained the phrase sovereign territorial integrity 14 times, which was their way of making sure everyone understood where they stood. The Moor Collective did not terminate anything. They were more careful than that. They simply began, very quietly, to explore certain shipping arrangements with human commercial interests. Exploratory, nothing formal, just 2 parties in a very large galaxy looking at each other with professional interest. The Dominion noticed. The Dominion sent a strongly worded communication to the Moor Collective about the importance of existing alliances. The Moor Collective responded warmly and said they valued their long relationship with the Dominion enormously, and the exploratory conversations with human commercial interests were purely economic and involved no strategic dimensions whatsoever. The Dominion read this response and understood what it meant. Vrail, High Commander of the Chorath Dominion, sat in his office on the capital station and looked at a map of what the Dominion controlled today versus what it had controlled 5 years ago. The map had not changed much. No territory lost, no direct military defeat since the Belt engagement. On paper, the Dominion was still a major power. On paper, the tributary income from the Tenhari was gone. The Greel had taken their shipping to alternate routes. The Voss Confederation, which had provided the Dominion with a useful buffer against Moor expansion, was now talking to humanity, which meant they were no longer reliably neutral. The Moor Collective was not an enemy, but they were no longer a close ally, and the difference between a close ally and a not quite ally was, in certain strategic situations, everything. And there was the manufacturing question. The Dominion produced ships, good ships, large ships, the kind of ships that had looked at humanity's 41 warships from a position of complete invulnerability and decided the math was obvious. Humanity also produced ships, and they were still producing them, and they had been producing them continuously for 5 years at a rate that was, by any reasonable measure, remarkable. And every iteration was better than the last because every iteration was designed by people who had been in actual combat with Chorath forces and understood exactly what they were designing against. The shield saturation weapon was now in its 5th generation. The fifth generation did not just saturate shields. It could be tuned to specific shield frequencies and was devastating against first-contact opponents who had not yet adapted their shielding. The Dominion's counter to this was in development. It had been in development for 3 years. The humans had produced 5 generations of improvement in the time it took the Dominion to produce one counter. Vrail's chief of staff, who was a very honest person by virtue of having given Vrail accurate bad news for 15 years without being fired for it, delivered the annual strategic assessment and then sat quietly while Vrail read it. The assessment said, in precise bureaucratic language that did everything except use the specific word, the Dominion was in decline. Not a crisis, not a collapse, a slow, measurable, consistent decline in relative power that, if the trend lines continued, would result in the Dominion being a significant but not dominant power in this region of the galaxy within 20 to 30 years. Can the trend line be reversed? Vrail asked. Possibly. It would require a significant change in. We have modeled several scenarios. And none of them involve the Sol system. The chief of staff was quiet for a moment. No, he said. We have modeled scenarios involving renewed conflict with humanity. In all of them, the outcome is worse than the current trend line. Vrail put down the assessment. He thought about a vote in a dead moon chamber. He thought about 41-1. He thought about a report from a fleet commander flagged urgent, immediate review required, and answered with instructions to increase patrol density. He thought about a dock worker, 4 words, 140 million shares. He thought about what Ambassador Vane had said. I am asking this council to not create that future. We created the future, he said. It was not really directed at his chief of staff. It was just a thing that needed to be said out loud. His chief of staff, who was a very honest person, said, yes. And now we live in it. Yes. Vrail looked at the map for a long time. Then he said, call Ambassador Vane. On what subject? Tell her I would like to discuss. Tell her I would like her perspective on the current regional situation and on how the Dominion might position itself for productive relationships going forward. He paused, including with humanity. His chief of staff wrote this down. And tell her that I read the report she filed with the council 2 years before Neptune, her original assessment. What should I say about it? Tell her she was right. Tell her I read it at the time and I didn't listen and she was right. He was quiet. She'll know what it means. The communication went out. Vane received it 2 hours later. She read it twice. The sphere held a color that was hard to name, not quite grief, not quite satisfaction, something older than both. She replied, I'll meet with him. She added one line. He said she was right. She appreciates that he said it. It doesn't undo anything, but it is something. She sent the reply and sat in the quiet of her quarters on the council station and thought about 4,000 years of history and what patterns things followed when you were old enough to have seen the patterns more than once. Empires built on force had a shape. They rose on the assumption that force was permanent. They met something that didn't fold. And they came, eventually, to the meeting she was about to have with the High Commander of the Chorath Dominion, where the question was no longer how to win, but how to remain relevant. The Dominion was not destroyed. The Dominion was not finished. But it was diminished, measurably, permanently. Its empire had not become ashes in the literal sense. No cities burned, no capitals fell. It had become ashes in the way that power becomes ashes when the fear it depends on stops working. When a species that should have been afraid looked at the numbers and decided the numbers were a starting point. When 12 researchers in a detention facility had names that a whole species refused to stop saying. When a dock worker typed 4 words and 140 million people agreed. Power that depends on the other side believing they can't win, becomes ashes the day the other side stops believing that. The Dominion had bet on humanity, believing they couldn't win. Humanity had never believed that. Not once. The day the treaty was signed, in the converted factory on the outskirts of Sao Paulo, Dr. Fatima Haydari had stood at her whiteboard and looked at the equations still covering it from the night she solved the shield problem. She did not erase them. She photographed them. She sent the photograph to her mother, who was a high school chemistry teacher and would understand roughly 40% of what was on the board and would be proud anyway. Her mother wrote back, "I have no idea what this means, but I'm putting it on the fridge." Haydari had laughed so hard she had to sit down. She put the image of the whiteboard in a file she was keeping. She labeled it, "The night we figured it out." Not the night she figured it out. The night we figured it out, because 18 people had been in that room and she was not the kind of person who forgot that. The war, if it could be called a war, had lasted 5 years. 341 humans had died. The final count, when the last incident reports came in, was 341. The names were all public. They were always going to be public. Haydari knew 3 of them. Not well, the military and civilian research sides of the conflict did not overlap much, but enough. Enough to feel the specific weight of knowing that someone is dead who was alive before a decision was made. And the decision didn't have to be made, and the people who made it hadn't wanted to. She sat with that for a while. Then she went back to work. Because that was the other thing about humans. The thing that Ambassador Vane had not said directly in the council chamber. The thing that was harder to put in a strategic briefing. The thing that was true but sounded like sentiment when you said it out loud. They grieve and they keep going. Not because they don't feel it. Because they feel it completely and they carry it and they keep going anyway, which is a different thing from not feeling it and a harder thing and a more human thing. 341 names, carried forward. The shipyards kept running. The engineers kept working. The diplomats kept building the framework that Akaffer had described to Shren Vel Moore, the structure of rules that would be there when humans weren't ready, when the next thing came, when the galaxy tried again. Because the galaxy would try again. History was a pattern, not a line. But the galaxy had new information now. The galaxy knew what happened when you tried. The Choreth Dominion knew what happened when you tried. Ambassador Vane, 600 years old and tired in the way deep things get tired, sat in her meeting with the High Commander of the Choreth Dominion and helped him find the language for what had happened and what came next. General Osei read the final casualty report and kept it in a drawer in her desk in Geneva, in the building with the bad lighting and the coffee and the whiteboard with the permanent marker stain. Admiral Watanabe took 3 weeks off this time. His staff agreed it was still not enough. Dr. James Obi, who had sat on the floor of the arrival platform and drunk a bottle of water and not said anything for a long time, went back to work 6 months later. Not Neptune. Neptune was gone, the station disassembled, the work interrupted. He started over. New data, new questions. The storms of Neptune from the new observation platform humanity was building, slowly, piece by piece, hauled up from Earth's gravity well at enormous cost, bolted together in vacuum by people in suits. The same way they'd done it before. The same way they'd always done it. Start the clock. Years later, many years, enough that the people who had been young were now the ones being asked to explain it. A historian named Orally Mbeki was writing a comprehensive account of the Sol system conflict. She interviewed every living participant she could find. She read every document. She watched every hour of footage. She spent 3 years trying to understand not just what happened, but why it happened the way it did. She interviewed Ambassador Vane near the end of her research. The Veth ambassador was older than she had been. Not visibly, the sphere looked the same, but there was something in the quality of her answers that felt like someone who had thought about these things very carefully for a very long time. Orally asked her, "Is there a single thing, one decision, one moment that you think changed the outcome?" Vane was quiet. "There are two," she said. "What's the first?" "The Choreth vote to proceed with annexation. Everything that followed came from that." "And the second?" "The dock worker," Vane said. Aurelie had the dock worker in her notes. She had tried to find Peter for an interview. He had declined. He had said, through a message that someone on his behalf had sent to her, that he hadn't done anything except type 4 words and he didn't see what there was to interview about. "Why the dock worker?" Aurelie asked. "Because of what he represented," Vane said. "The Choreth made their decision in a chamber designed to impress 43 species, legal process, strategic analysis, and their decision was wrong. The dock worker made his decision on his lunch break, and it was right. Not the tactic, 4 words is not a military strategy, but the decision behind it. The immediate, instinctive, species-wide understanding that this was not acceptable and they were going to deal with it." The sphere shifted. "That is what I could not explain to the council. You cannot model that. You cannot account for it in fleet size or weapons projections. It is a quality, and species that have it." She stopped. "Species that have it are very difficult to defeat," Aurelie offered. "Species that have it," Vane said, "are very difficult to discourage, which is not the same thing, and is, in many ways, more important." Aurelie wrote this down. She put it, eventually, near the end of the book, in a chapter called simply The Warning. The book was read by many species, not just humans. The Tenhari translated it. The Greel produced an annotated edition. The Moore Collective Strategic Studies programs used it as a primary text for 15 years. The chapter called The Warning was the most frequently cited. The most frequently cited sentence in it was the one from Vane. "Species that have it are very difficult to discourage." And below it, in a footnote, Aurelie had put the 4 words. Not Peter's name, he'd asked for that. Just the 4 words, standing alone on the page, which was enough. "Start the clock."